I really like raised beds, and most of my gardening is done in them. But for all of the benefits, it's not all good. Hi, I'm Gardener Scott, and I discuss everything gardening so you can become a better gardener. Today, let's talk about the problems with raised beds. If you're just getting into gardening or expanding your garden, I do recommend raised beds. But along with the many benefits, there are some issues to be concerned with. With the pros come the cons. And in this video, I'm going to highlight 10 of those issues to be aware of before you start raised bed gardening. The first issue is the cost. If you just pick some bare ground and amend it a little bit and start growing in it, the cost is minimal. But if you want to grow in raised beds, you have to construct the bed. If you can find reclaimed wood, that's wonderful. But in most cases, we buy our wood. That jacks up the cost. I think one of the best benefits of raised bed gardening is being able to fill it with the soil of your choice. But in most cases, you're going to have to buy that soil. That ups the cost. Each of these beds cost me a little less than $100 to construct and fill with soil. The beds on the other side behind me, those tall ones, they cost closer to $200 to build and fill. Now they're big beds and I'll be able to grow a lot of plants in them, but that upfront cost is a major consideration when you start raised bed gardening. That's one reason why I recommend starting small with just one or two raised beds to help it fit into your budget and to ensure that you do like raised bed gardening before you commit yourself to building a lot of them and spending a lot of money. The second problem is that raised beds dry out faster than the basic ground. Because they're raised, they're exposed to more wind, they have four sides that are exposed to the air, and so they're going to dry out faster. That means you need to use more water in a raised bed to keep the soil evenly moist. In open ground, it dries out at the surface pretty uniformly, but deeper down, it almost always stays moist. You have to keep a better eye on your raised beds when it comes to watering, because not only that top layer of soil is going to dry out, but all the soil around the edges, it works its way in, and before you know it, you've got plants that are suffering because the soil just isn't moist enough. The third problem with raised beds is that you can't use a lot of the machinery or the tools that you can use when you're gardening in open ground. If you like to till in amendments at the end of the season, well, that's kind of hard to do in a lot of raised beds, particularly the tall ones. And the tall ones make it more difficult to get a shovel or a spade in to amend your soil. You have to consider those type of factors. And if you have a lot of raised beds and they're too close together, you might not be able to get your wheelbarrow in to deal with the soil and the mulch. Open ground has some benefits because it's easy to access. Raised beds, when it comes to those type of tools, not so easy. The fourth highlighted problem is that the soil temperature within the beds is going to vary a lot more than just open ground. The material that they're made from, be it wood or concrete or metal like the ones behind me, that's going to affect how the soil temperature warms up. And the volume of the soil within the different sized beds will also determine the soil temperature. Open bed is going to be pretty consistent, but there's going to be variation in the raised beds. Most of the time, that's not a big problem. But if you're growing plants that are susceptible to changes in the soil temperature, you need to be aware of that. Because not only do they warm up faster in the spring, which could be a benefit, but they cool off faster in fall. So plants that might be okay in open ground going into winter, well, the ground might be too cold, maybe even frozen in these raised beds long before the open beds. Another problem with raised beds There's a lot of labor involved, especially up front. It took me a long time to build these beds, and it took even longer to fill them with soil. The bed I had in the previous shot, those concrete blocks, took me 3 days to build and then fill with soil. You can save a lot of time by just digging some holes and planting in the ground. But for raised bed gardening, to do it right and to look good, you need some planning. You need that effort. You need that labor to get them up and running. You could just throw them together. I don't think that looks as good. So prepare to work hard. Another problem you need to be aware of is that these raised beds don't last forever. In fact, many of them don't even last a long time. Depending on the material, you have to plan for replacement. This is basic untreated fir, and after just a year, it's already starting to crack and break down. Not rotting from the inside, which is the most common assumption, but it's been exposed to the weather. And even with a wood preserver, I expect only about 5 years of practical life out of this wood. You can get longer life if you use materials like redwood, cedar, and pressure-treated wood, but that jacks up the cost even more. So, after 5 years or so, I know that all of these boards are going to have to be replaced. Another problem is that even though these raised beds are very efficient and you can get some intensive plantings within them, the space between is typically going to be more than if you had an open bed. You need pathways between these raised beds to access them, to bring a wheelbarrow in, to do the normal activities. And for me, about 2 feet is the minimum space between the beds to be able to get all of my gardening work done. But in an open area, you don't need paths that are 2 feet wide every 3 or 4 feet. You can grow more in this amount of space if this were all open ground. They can be efficient, but because of the pathways needed between the raised beds, you might not really be able to grow as much. So if you've got a small space and you want to garden and grow a lot, well, maybe raised beds might not be your best option because of the space necessary between them. Depending on your style of raised bed, you might be limiting yourself as to your plant choice. Higher raised beds like this have great options for deep-rooted vegetables, for many other plants. But if I want to grow tall tomatoes up a trellis, well, they might not work in a bed that's already 2 feet high because as they grow, I just can't reach to the top of those tomato plants. Tall beds limit me when I grow some of those tall vining plants. Low beds might be just the opposite. This is where I'll be growing a lot of my tall vines, but because of that shorter depth, I might not be able to grow some of those deep-rooted plants, especially if the bed is on top of tree roots or some type of contaminated soil. That's why I've got beds of all different heights and sizes, so that I can have the option to grow a lot of different plants in these different beds. But if you're growing in a pretty small space and you only have a few beds, you really have to think about the size of the bed and the plant choice that you're limiting yourself to based on that style of bed. And raised bed gardening, even though I can sit on them and work easily, they will add more work to a typical gardening day, especially if you're using a system like square foot gardening, which can be labor intensive for the planning and the preparation and taking care of each of these individual square feet. And for straw bale gardening, like the bales behind me that require a lot more fertilization and watering to keep the plants growing. In open ground, you can just do rows, go out for a few minutes every day and tend to your plants. But because you're growing a lot more plants typically in a raised bed system, you're going to be spending more time on each individual plant. Bring that into your schedule and how you plan to garden. Raised beds just might be a little more work, especially when you throw in hoops and covers and bird netting. and all of those other things that we typically ignore in open bed gardening. Another problem is that raised beds end up becoming relatively permanent. Sure, I can break them down, I can move them, but after all that upfront labor and cost, why would I want to do that? So account for that in your planning. Anticipate where your beds are going to go and how that's going to affect your work. Because what ends up happening is, even when we find out that the raised beds aren't in the best position, we just work around it. It's so much easier just to leave it be than to change it. In open ground, you don't have that problem. I can modify it however I want. I could change it over to grass or trees or vice versa. But once raised beds are in, they tend to stay in. And you adjust your gardening around your raised beds. Now, I love raised beds, and I do recommend them. And as I said earlier, it's my preferred method of gardening. But it's not all good. You need to take into account some of these potential problems before you decide to do your raised bed gardening. If you have any questions, please let me know in the comments below. And if you want to become a better gardener, well then consider some of these videos to watch next. I'm Gardener Scott. Enjoy gardening.